This video is by Straight Goods News, SGNews.ca.
My name is Garry Neil. I am Executive Director of the Council of Canadians, which is Canada's largest social justice organization. We have roughly 75,000 supporters from coast to coast to coast. With me today is Peggy Walsh-Craig from North Bay and Sandra McEwing from Winnipeg. Peggy is an elector in the riding of Nipissing-Temiskaming, and Sandra is an elector in the riding of Winnipeg South Centre. In March, the Council of Canadians launched a campaign to invite Canadians to let us know what dirty tricks had been played on them during the May 2011 federal election, and to advise them of legal rights they have as an elector. Sadly for Canadian democracy, hundreds of Canadians responded to our invitation with stories of fraud, harassment, and other voter suppression techniques. Elections Canada now has almost 1,400 active complaints in 200 ridings, and we are very disappointed that nothing has yet come from Elections Canada investigations. However, as you know, 8 Canadians in 6 ridings stepped forward to tell their story in court applications which seek to overturn the results because the fraudulent activities affected the outcome. Now that all of the evidence is in for the court to consider in early December, we thought it was an appropriate time to review where we are and to, frankly, highlight the stories of these individual Canadians. So the federal court in Ottawa will be considering these cases December 10th to the 14th. And briefly, the evidence they're being asked to consider by the applicants is this. First, we have the affidavits of the applicants and others who received these calls. There's affidavits from Annette Desgagnés, a former employee of RMG, which was a company employed by the Conservative Party of Canada to get out the vote calls, and she believes she made some of the misleading calls, including into the riding of Nipissing-Temiskaming. We have an affidavit from Robert Penner of Strategic Communications, a company which undertakes this kind of work for other political parties than the Conservative Party of Canada, who said that such a voter suppression campaign would have to have been authorized by a senior person in a central campaign with access to the database and authority to spend money. The Conservative Party of Canada now admits that it made calls concerning possible changes in polling locations, despite the fact that there were relatively few changes in the country, and they were asked by Elections Canada not to do so. And these calls were made into 5 of the 6 ridings involved in these cases when there was only one polling station in one of the ridings that was changed. We have evidence of Elections Canada investigator Alan Matthews, who believes that the numbers used to make the misleading calls in the riding of Guelph were taken from a list of non-Conservative Party of Canada supporters stored in the Conservative Party of Canada's Constituency Information Management System, the CIMS. So given all of this evidence, we wonder why the Conservative Party of Canada chose not to file and adduce evidence related to CIMS. And finally, we have the evidence of ECOS research. In the survey that ECOS undertook, close to 25% of respondents in the subject ridings said that they had received misleading calls. Thus, there were tens of thousands of fraudulent calls made. ECOS also demonstrates that they were targeted at non-supporters of the Conservative Party of Canada. If you were a Liberal, you were 3.7 times more likely to receive such a call. And if you were a supporter of the NDP, you were 2.8 times more likely to receive such a call. And finally, ECOS concludes they were effective in suppressing the vote, and the estimated impact is 1.0%, which has a margin of error of 0.4% 19 times out of 20. The ECOS research is corroborated by Dr. Neil Nevitt, who's a professor of political science at the University of Toronto, cross-appointed to the School of Public Policy and Governance and to the School of Global Affairs. And Dr. Nevitt is a global expert in matters of elections, electoral fraud. He has undertaken significant research both in Canada and internationally. He's a senior advisor with the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. And he refutes the so-called expert evidence adduced by the Conservative Party of Canada and points out that it does not address two of the critical conclusions of the ECOS results, that the incidence of fraudulent calling was widespread and that it was targeted at non-Conservative Party of Canada supporters to such an extent that it could not be a result of chance. I want to step back a little bit. You know, we always talk about these things like accurate 3.5% of the time, plus or minus 0.8, 19 times out of 20. What does that mean? It means what could happen on that 20th time. Instead of 3.9%, it could be 4.5%. Instead of 1.6%, it could be 2.2%. But when you have a result that says you were 370% more likely to get a fraudulent call if you were a supporter of the Liberal Party of Canada, that is not an artifact of chance. The 19th time out of 20 would suggest maybe it was 350%, or maybe it was 390%. It was not 0%. And that's a very powerful figure that they simply do not tackle. Being able to participate in elections is at the very heart of our democracy. It's a fundamental right enjoyed by every Canadian and is protected by law. Someone deprived thousands of Canadians of that right during the May 2011 federal election, and we hope the court will restore that right to Canadians in these 6 ridings. The remedy is to find the culprit and prosecute them criminally. The remedy for an individual elector is to take an action under Section 524 of the Elections Act and say this fraudulent criminal activity occurred in my riding and it affected the outcome. The Opitz case, we agree, plays in a sense both ways, but we believe that what we're dealing with here is something that's quite different than the administrative issues that were tackled by both the federal court and the Supreme Court in the Opitz case, where you're dealing with registration of voters and the legality of the ballots cast. We're dealing here with something that's new and has not been seen before in Canada, and certainly there has been no legal judgment on issues of fraudulent activity and attempting and succeeding in depriving voters from the right to vote.